Darnell Kincaid stood in his bedroom doorway at 2:15 in the morning, staring at the safe embedded in his closet wall. The metal door sat flush against the frame, exactly where it should be, but the edge where the door met the wall showed a faint scrape mark in the paint that hadn't been there that morning. He crouched down and ran his thumb along the scratch. His chest tightened. He'd been managing money and operations for 3 years now, ever since his cousin died in federal custody and a group of men showed up at his apartment with ledgers and instructions. Darnell had been an accountant back then, good with numbers, careful with details. Those same instincts told him something was wrong the moment he stepped into the room. The safe hadn't been opened by force. There were no pry marks, no damage to the lock, but it had been moved. Slightly. Just enough. He spun the combination and pulled the door open. Everything was still inside. Envelopes of cash, documents with names and addresses, a ledger tracking payments that would never appear on any tax return. Nothing missing. But the stack of papers on the left side had been shuffled. He always kept them in a specific order. Newest on top, oldest on bottom, all facing the same direction. Now they were uneven. Some rotated, some out of sequence. Someone had been in here. Someone had taken photos. Darnell stood up, walked to Zuri's room, and pushed the door open quietly. His 6-year-old daughter lay curled on her side, one hand tucked under her pillow, breathing steady and soft. He watched her for a long moment, then closed the door and went back downstairs. Caprice was still awake, sitting on the couch with her phone in her lap. She looked up when he came into the living room, her face tired but calm. If you're following this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. What would you do in this situation? Darnell kept his voice level. He asked if she'd been upstairs while he was out. Caprice shook her head. She said she'd stayed down here the whole time, watching TV with Zuri until bedtime. Darnell asked again, slower this time, if she'd gone into his bedroom for any reason. Caprice frowned, looked confused, said no. He didn't answer. He just told her it was late and she should head home. Caprice stood, gathered her things, and left without asking anything else. Darnell locked the door behind her, then went back upstairs and woke Zuri gently. He sat on the edge of her bed and asked if Caprice had gone upstairs earlier. Zuri rubbed her eyes, nodded. She said Caprice got a phone call and went upstairs for a few minutes while Zuri was watching cartoons. He kissed his daughter on the forehead, told her to go back to sleep, and walked into the hallway. His phone was already in his hand. He called Caprice. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. By 7 in the morning, when Zuri woke up asking for breakfast, Darnell tried one last time. The number was disconnected. 6 months earlier, Darnell had been standing in the same kitchen, staring at a voicemail from Zuri's teacher. It was the second call that week. The message was careful, professional, but the concern underneath it was clear. Zuri wasn't talking in class. She'd had an accident during nap time. Darnell deleted the voicemail and sat down at the table with his head in his hands. Zuri's mother, Shanice, had been dead for 4 months. Darnell had full custody because there was no one else. Shanice's mother was dying of cancer. Her sister was in rehab, and Darnell was the only parent left. He was dropping Zuri off at daycare at 7 in the morning and picking her up after 6. He microwaved dinners, sat with her while she ate, then put her to bed and stayed up past midnight reconciling payments for the businesses he'd inherited. Payments that came from men who didn't care that he had a daughter sleeping one room over. Zuri had started wetting the bed again. She'd stopped talking at daycare. She cried when he dropped her off and didn't smile when he picked her up. Darnell knew he was failing her, but he didn't know how to stop. 3 days after the teacher's second call, Darnell went to a networking event at a hotel in Harbor East. It was the kind of thing he attended to maintain appearances, businessmen in suits, real estate developers, city officials pretending they didn't know where half the money in the room came from. That's where he met Simone Whitaker. She was standing near the bar, talking to a zoning commissioner about a property dispute in East Baltimore. Darnell noticed her because she wasn't flattering the commissioner or laughing at his jokes. She was correcting him, citing code violations and tax law, and the commissioner was nodding like he was taking notes. Darnell waited until the conversation ended, then introduced himself. Simone shook his hand, asked what he did. He told her he ran a property management company and a restaurant. She asked which neighborhoods. He told her. She nodded, said she'd heard of the restaurant. They talked for 20 minutes. She didn't ask too many questions about his businesses, and Darnell appreciated that. When the event ended, Simone said it was nice to meet him and turned to leave. Darnell asked if she wanted to get coffee sometime. She looked at him for a moment, then said sure. 2 weeks later, Simone came over to his house for dinner. She brought a science kit for Zuri, a volcano set with baking soda and vinegar. Zuri had been quiet when Simone arrived, hiding behind Darnell's leg. But when Simone sat down on the living room carpet and started unpacking the kit, Zuri crept closer. By the time Darnell finished making dinner, the two of them had built the volcano and were setting off the eruption for the 3rd time. Zuri laughing so hard she could barely stand. It was the first time Zuri had smiled in weeks. Simone's flight left on a Thursday morning. Darnell drove her to the airport. Zuri strapped into the back seat, half asleep. Simone kissed Zuri goodbye, then turned to Darnell and reminded him to keep things steady. She said her father's prognosis wasn't clear, yet she'd be gone at least a month, maybe 6 weeks. Darnell told her not to worry. He said he'd handle everything. Simone looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and walked towards security. Darnell drove back to the house, dropped Zuri off at school, and went straight to the car wash on Eastern Avenue. 2 of his crew leads were waiting for him in the office. They told him there was a problem. A group running corners in East Baltimore had started pushing into territory that belonged to one of Darnell's partners. The partner wanted a sit-down. He wanted Darnell there. Darnell asked when. They said tonight. He called the after-school program and told them Zuri would be staying late. The meeting went long. Darnell didn't get back to pick up Zuri until almost 8. She was the last kid in the program, sitting alone at a table in the cafeteria with a teacher who looked exhausted. Zuri didn't say anything on the drive home. By the 2nd week, Zuri's teacher called again. She said Zuri had been acting withdrawn. She asked if everything was okay at home. Darnell said everything was fine. It wasn't. He needed help. He needed someone who could pick Zuri up from school, make her dinner, and keep her stable while he handled the work that couldn't wait. But he couldn't bring in just anyone. Simone's rule was clear. No one from his other life. No one who wasn't vetted. No one who could put Zuri at risk. That's when Lorraine, the woman who cleaned the restaurant, mentioned her niece's friend. A young woman named Caprice who'd just moved up from North Carolina and was looking for part-time work. Lorraine said Caprice was good with kids. She'd raised her younger siblings after her mother died. Darnell asked for her number. Lorraine gave it to him that afternoon. Caprice came over the next day for an interview. She was 24, soft-spoken, dressed in a clean sweater and jeans. She said she'd moved to Baltimore a few months ago to get away from family drama back home. She said she'd worked at a daycare in Charlotte. Zuri came downstairs while they were talking. Darnell introduced her to Caprice. Caprice smiled, crouched down to Zuri's level, and asked what her favorite subject in school was. Zuri said science. Caprice asked what kind of experiments Zuri liked. Zuri started talking about the volcano Simone had helped her build. Darnell hired her on the spot. Caprice started the following Monday. She picked Zuri up from school, brought her home, helped with homework, and made simple dinners: spaghetti, grilled cheese, chicken nuggets. When Darnell came home, Zuri was fed, clean, and calm. It worked. By the end of the first week, Zuri's teacher stopped calling. By the end of the second week, Zuri was talking more, smiling again, asking when Caprice was coming over. Darnell felt the tension in his chest start to ease. Simone called from Atlanta and asked how things were going. Darnell told her everything was fine. He said Zuri was doing well. He didn't mention Caprice. He told himself it was because he didn't want Simone to worry while she was dealing with her father. But 2 weeks after Caprice started, Darnell came home late and found her still awake, sitting on the couch with red eyes and a tissue balled up in her hand. He asked what was wrong. Caprice looked up at him, hesitated, then said her cousin was in trouble. She said he owed money to someone dangerous, and she didn't know what to do. She didn't ask Darnell for help. She didn't say who the person was or how much her cousin owed. But the way she looked at him steady, searching, made it clear she knew. She knew what Darnell was. She was testing to see if he'd help. Darnell sat down across from Caprice and asked what kind of trouble. Caprice wiped her eyes, took a breath, and said her cousin had borrowed money from someone back in Charlotte to cover rent and bills after losing his job. She said the guy told him it wasn't a big deal, that he could pay it back whenever. But now the guy was calling, saying the cousin owed double what he'd borrowed. Darnell asked how much. Caprice said $4,000. He pulled $200 out of his wallet and set it on the table. He told Caprice to give it to her cousin and tell him to leave Charlotte. He said if the guy was real trouble, distance was the only solution. Caprice stared at the money, then looked up at Darnell with something close to gratitude. She thanked him. Caprice took the money and left. For 2 weeks, everything was normal. Caprice showed up on time, took care of Zuri, and never mentioned her cousin or the money again. Then Simone called. It was a Tuesday night, just after 9. Darnell was sitting at the kitchen table, going over a payment ledger, when his phone buzzed. Simone's name appeared on the screen. Simone asked if everything was okay at home. Darnell said yes. Simone paused, then said she'd gotten a message. Darnell asked what kind of message. Simone said it was from someone she didn't know, a woman. The message said Darnell had a new situation at home, and Simone might want to check in. Darnell's grip tightened on the phone, so he told her. He told her about Caprice, about how Lorraine had recommended her, about how Zuri had been doing better since she started. He told her about the night Caprice had been crying, about the cousin and the money. Simone didn't interrupt. She listened all the way through. When Darnell finished, there was a long silence. Then Simone said, "Fire her." Darnell started to respond, but Simone cut him off. She said it didn't matter if Caprice was telling the truth or not. Someone knew enough to send that message. Someone knew Caprice was in Darnell's house, around his daughter, and they were using it to send a signal. Darnell said he'd handle it. Simone asked when. Darnell said soon. Simone asked how soon. Darnell hesitated. He said Zuri was finally stable, and he didn't have anyone else lined up. He said he'd wait until Simone got back, and they'd figure it out together. There was another long silence. Then Simone said, "Darnell, I'm not asking." Darnell told her he understood. He told her he'd take care of it. Simone said okay, and then she hung up. Darnell sat at the table, staring at his phone. He thought about Zuri, about how she'd been laughing again, talking again, sleeping through the night. He thought about the teacher's calls, the accidents, the fear in his daughter's eyes every time he dropped her off late. He decided he'd wait. Just a few more days. Just until he could find someone else. 3 nights later, Darnell came home and knew immediately something was wrong. The house felt different. Caprice was downstairs with Zuri, helping her practice spelling words at the kitchen table. Everything looked normal. But when Darnell went upstairs to change, he stopped in the hallway outside his bedroom. The door was open. He always closed it. He stepped inside and walked over to the closet, and he saw the scratch on the safe. Darnell sat in his kitchen the next morning, phone in hand, staring at the contact list. He scrolled past names he hadn't called in months, men his cousin used to work with, crew leads who reported to him now, people who moved product and collected debts. He stopped on one name, Maurice Trent. Maurice had been his cousin's right hand before the arrest. He was older, careful, the kind of man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. If anyone knew who might be making a move on Darnell, it was Maurice. Darnell pressed call. Maurice picked up on the third ring. Darnell didn't waste time. He said he needed to meet. Maurice asked when. Darnell said today. Maurice said he'd be at the car wash in an hour. Darnell hung up, looked over at Zuri eating cereal at the table, and told her to get ready for school. She asked where Caprice was. Darnell said Caprice wasn't coming anymore. Zuri's face fell. She asked why. Darnell said sometimes people have to leave, and it's not anyone's fault. Zuri didn't say anything else. She just put her bowl in the sink and went upstairs to get dressed. An hour later, Darnell stood in the back office of the car wash, arms crossed, waiting. Maurice walked in, closed the door behind him, and sat down without greeting. He asked what happened. Darnell told him. He told him about Caprice, about the safe, about the disconnected phone number and the car that drove east toward the county line. He told him someone had gone through his documents, and he needed to know who sent her. Maurice listened without interrupting. When Darnell finished, Maurice leaned back in his chair and said one name: Kelton Hughes. Kelton was one of the crew lieutenants Darnell had inherited when his cousin died. He ran collections in West Baltimore, handled disputes, kept things moving. He'd been reliable for 3 years. But Maurice said Kelton had been asking questions lately. Questions about how much Darnell was pulling in, who he was meeting with, how the money was being split. Maurice said he'd heard Kelton talking to people about restructuring operations, about bringing in someone who knew the streets better. Darnell asked why Maurice hadn't told him sooner. Maurice said he didn't have proof, just talk, and talk didn't mean anything until it did. Darnell asked if Maurice thought Kelton sent Caprice. Maurice said he didn't know, but if someone wanted leverage on Darnell, sending a girl into his house to photograph his records was exactly the kind of move Kelton would make. Quiet, clean, hard to trace. Darnell felt his jaw tighten. He asked what Kelton wanted. Maurice said probably what everyone wanted: control. Kelton thought he could run things better. He thought Darnell was soft, distracted, too worried about playing businessman to handle the real work. Darnell stood up. He told Maurice to set up a meeting with Kelton. Maurice asked when. Darnell said tonight. Maurice nodded and left. Darnell stayed in the office, staring at the wall. If Kelton had those documents, he could use them to turn Darnell's own people against him. He could hand them to the feds. He could sell them to rivals, or he could just sit on them and wait, watching Darnell squirm until he made a mistake. Darnell's phone buzzed. A text from Simone. Landing in 2 hours. We need to talk. He stared at the message. He thought about what he was going to say when she walked through the door. He thought about Zuri, sitting in class right now, probably wondering why Caprice didn't pick her up anymore. Then he thought about the meeting with Kelton, and what he'd have to do if Maurice was right. Simone came home just after 3 in the afternoon. Darnell was sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in. She set her bag down by the door, looked at him, and didn't say hello. She just pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. She asked if Zuri was safe. Darnell said yes. Simone asked where Caprice was. Darnell said gone. Simone asked if he knew where. Darnell said no. Simone reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She opened a message thread and turned the screen toward him. It was a photo. Caprice and Zuri at the park. Zuri on the swings. Caprice standing beside her, smiling. Underneath the photo, a single line of text. She's been very helpful. We'll be in touch. Darnell stared at the message. He asked when Simone got it. She said 3 days ago. He asked why she didn't tell him. Simone said she wanted to see what he'd do first. Darnell leaned back in his chair. He told her about the safe, about Maurice, about Kelton. He told her he had a meeting tonight, and depending on how it went, this could either end quietly or turn into something worse. Simone didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, her face unreadable. Then she said, "You put her in danger because you didn't want to deal with an inconvenience." Darnell started to argue, but Simone held up a hand. She said she wasn't interested in excuses. She said Darnell had made a choice. He'd ignored her warning, kept Caprice around because it was easier, and now someone had leverage on him. Someone who knew where they lived, someone who had access to their daughter. Darnell said he was going to fix it. Simone asked how. Darnell said he'd handle Kelton. Simone asked what that meant. Darnell didn't answer. Simone stood up. She walked over to the counter, poured herself a glass of water, and stood there for a long moment, staring out the window. Then she said, "I'm taking Zuri to Atlanta tonight." Darnell stood up. He said that wasn't necessary. Simone turned around and said it absolutely was. She said until Darnell figured out who sent that message and what they wanted, Zuri wasn't staying in this house. Darnell asked how long. Simone said as long as it took. She went upstairs to pack. Darnell sat back down at the table and put his head in his hands. He heard Simone moving around in Zuri's room, opening drawers, zipping bags. He heard Zuri come home from school, heard her ask Simone why they were packing, heard Simone tell her they were going to visit her grandmother for a little while. Zuri came downstairs and asked Darnell if he was coming too. Darnell said no, he had to stay and work. Zuri asked when she'd see him again. Darnell said soon. He pulled her into a hug and held on longer than usual. 2 hours later, Simone and Zuri were gone. Darnell sat alone in the quiet house, staring at the clock. At 7:30, his phone buzzed. A text from Maurice. He's at the warehouse, waiting. Darnell grabbed his keys and walked out the door. The warehouse was on the east side, near the rail yards, a place Darnell's cousin used to use for off-the-books meetings. Darnell parked outside, walked through the side entrance, and found Kelton Hughes sitting on a metal folding chair in the middle of the empty floor. Kelton was in his early 30s, lean, with a scar across his left eyebrow from a fight years ago. He looked up when Darnell walked in but didn't stand. He just smiled. Darnell stopped a few feet away and asked where Caprice was. Kelton said he didn't know anyone named Caprice. Darnell said that was interesting, because Caprice had been in his house, gone through his safe, and disappeared the same week Kelton started asking questions about restructuring operations. Kelton's smile widened. He said Darnell had a vivid imagination. Then he said maybe if Darnell spent less time playing house and more time managing business, he wouldn't be so paranoid. Darnell asked what Kelton wanted. Kelton stood up. He said he wanted what everyone wanted, a fair cut. He said Darnell had been running things for 3 years, taking the biggest share, making decisions without consulting the people doing the actual work. He said it was time for a change. Darnell asked what kind of change. Kelton said simple. Darnell steps back, keeps his legitimate businesses, stays clean. Kelton takes over operations. Everyone gets paid. No one gets hurt. Darnell asked what happens if he says no. Kelton pulled out his phone, opened a photo, and held it up. It was a picture of one of the documents from Darnell's safe, a payment ledger with names, dates, and amounts. Kelton said he had copies of everything. He said if Darnell didn't step back, those documents would end up in the hands of people who'd know exactly what to do with them. Darnell stared at the photo. He asked if Kelton was working alone. Kelton said it didn't matter. What mattered was that Darnell didn't have a choice. Darnell took a step closer. He said Kelton had made a mistake. He said going after him was one thing, but putting Caprice in his house, around his daughter, was something else. He said that crossed a line. Kelton shrugged. He said Darnell should have thought about that before he let a stranger into his home. Darnell felt his hands curl into fists. He wanted to swing. He wanted to put Kelton on the floor and make him regret every word. But he didn't. Because Kelton was right about one thing, Darnell didn't have proof. And without proof, anything he did would look like paranoia or weakness. So instead, Darnell said he'd think about it. Kelton said he had 48 hours. Then he walked past Darnell and out the door. Darnell stood alone in the warehouse, breathing hard. He pulled out his phone and called Maurice. When Maurice answered, Darnell said one sentence: "Find Caprice." Maurice called back the next afternoon. He said he'd found her. Caprice was staying at a motel in Glen Burnie, registered under a different name, paying cash. Maurice said he had someone watching the place, and Caprice hadn't left her room in 2 days. Darnell told Maurice to keep eyes on her but don't approach. He said he'd handle it himself. That night, Darnell drove to the motel. It was a low-budget place off Route 2, the kind with peeling paint and broken parking lot lights. He found Caprice's room on the 2nd floor and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. He heard movement inside, footsteps, then silence. Darnell said her name. He said he wasn't there to hurt her, he just wanted to talk. The door opened a crack. Caprice looked out, her face pale, eyes red like she hadn't slept. She asked how he found her. Darnell said it didn't matter. He asked if she was going to let him in. Caprice hesitated, then opened the door. Darnell stepped inside. The room was small, one bed, a single lamp, clothes piled on a chair. Caprice sat down on the edge of the bed and wrapped her arms around herself. Darnell stayed standing. He asked who sent her. Caprice said no one sent her. Darnell said he didn't believe that. He said someone put her in his house, told her what to look for, and gave her a way out when things went wrong. He said if she didn't tell him the truth, he couldn't help her. Caprice started crying. She said she didn't have a choice. She said her cousin really did owe money, and the person he owed it to was connected to Kelton. She said Kelton told her if she helped him, he'd make the debt go away. All she had to do was get into Darnell's house, find his safe, and take pictures. Darnell asked if she knew what was in those pictures. Caprice said no. She said she just did what Kelton told her. She said she didn't want to hurt anyone. Darnell asked where the pictures were now. Caprice said she gave them to Kelton the night she left. She said he told her to disappear for a few days, and he'd contact her when it was safe. Darnell asked if Kelton knew where she was. Caprice said she didn't think so. She said she'd been hiding, trying to figure out what to do. Darnell sat down in the chair across from her. He said Kelton wasn't going to let her walk away. He said she was a loose end, and loose ends didn't last long in this business. He said if she wanted to survive, she needed to help him. Caprice looked up, wiping her eyes. She asked what he wanted. Darnell said he needed her to testify. Not to the police, to the people Kelton worked with. He needed her to tell them Kelton had set this whole thing up, that he'd used her to gather evidence against Darnell without their approval. Caprice shook her head. She said if she did that, Kelton would kill her. Darnell said if she didn't, Kelton would kill her anyway. Caprice sat in silence for a long time. Then she asked what would happen to her cousin if she helped. Darnell said he'd make sure the debt was cleared. Caprice asked how. Darnell said he had connections, people who owed him favors. Caprice looked down at her hands. Then she nodded. 3 days later, Darnell sat in the back room of his restaurant, surrounded by 5 men who'd worked with his cousin and now answered to him. Maurice was there. So was Caprice, sitting in the corner, arms crossed, looking like she wanted to disappear. Kelton wasn't there. But word had already spread. Word that Caprice had come forward. Word that she'd told Darnell everything. One of the men asked if Darnell had proof. Darnell pulled out his phone and played a recording. It was Caprice's voice, explaining how Kelton had approached her, what he'd asked her to do, and how he'd promised to protect her if she helped him gather evidence against Darnell. The room went quiet. Maurice asked what Darnell wanted to do. Darnell said he wanted Kelton out. No retaliation, no violence, just gone. He said Kelton could keep whatever money he'd saved, but he was done working in Baltimore. If he stayed, if he tried anything else, the recording would go to people who wouldn't be as understanding. The men looked at each other. Then one of them nodded. The others followed. It was done. Kelton left Baltimore 2 days later. Darnell never saw him again. The documents Caprice had photographed never surfaced. Maurice handled the cleanup, making sure every copy was destroyed. A week after that, Simone came home. She walked into the house, set her bags down, and looked at Darnell. He told her everything about Kelton, about Caprice, about the meeting and the recording. He told her it was over. Simone asked if he was sure. Darnell said, as sure as he could be. Simone sat down at the kitchen table. She asked what he was going to do now. Darnell said he didn't know. He said he'd been thinking about stepping back, maybe letting Maurice take over more of the operations. He said he wanted to focus on the businesses that wouldn't put Zuri at risk. Simone asked if he meant that. Darnell said he did. She didn't respond right away. Then she said, "You put her in danger because you didn't want to deal with an inconvenience. So now you have to decide what kind of father you actually want to be." Darnell nodded. He said he knew. 2 days later, Zuri came home. She ran through the door, dropped her backpack, and hugged Darnell so tight he could barely breathe. She asked if everything was okay now. Darnell said yes. She asked if Caprice was coming back. Darnell said no, but they'd find someone new, someone better. Zuri nodded, then went upstairs to unpack. Darnell stood in the hallway, watching her go. He thought about the choices he'd made, the lines he'd crossed, the danger he'd brought into his home because he'd been too afraid to face the inconvenience of change. He thought about Simone's words. He thought about what kind of father he wanted to be. And for the first time in 3 years, he thought maybe he could actually choose. The next morning, Darnell called Maurice and told him he was stepping back. Maurice asked if he was sure. Darnell said he was. Maurice said he'd handle things. Darnell hung up, walked into the kitchen, and poured himself a cup of coffee. Simone came downstairs, saw him standing there, and asked what he was thinking about. Darnell said he was thinking about Zuri, about what she deserved, about what he owed her. Simone walked over and stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand on his shoulder, and Darnell knew, in that moment, that he'd made the right choice. Because sometimes the bravest thing a father can do isn't protecting his empire, it's protecting his child, even if it means walking away from everything he thought he needed to survive. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next true story that will challenge what you think about life and fatherhood. Share your thoughts in the comments to inspire others. What would you have done in Darnell's position? Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in the streets. They're fought in the quiet moments, when you have to choose between the life you've built and the life your child deserves. Darnell chose his daughter, and in the end, that choice saved them both.